listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
Good. How does my voice sound? Do I still sound hoarse?
No, you sound all right. I know we've had some pretty long days here the last couple of days with meetings all day, but you were also battling a recent illness too. So no, you sound marvelous.
You sound marvelous. No, I wanted to let everyone know like how disappointed I was that I couldn't join you at the FIDO Authenticate conference. So when we're recording, it's the week. This is the first episode we've recorded since your return. I was proud of you, man. I thought you did a fantastic job giving our presentation. And I thought you looked really sharp too. I watched the live stream. So I think our plan is we're going to take the audio from that and run it sometime at the end of the year, right?
Yeah, I've got it. I don't know when we'll put it. I think we kind of took that in our back pocket as far as when maybe we need an off week or something like that. But yeah, thank you very much for ditching me and making me. This was all your idea to go and present. I was like, oh, I'll go and I'll support you, and maybe we do some podcasts. And yeah.
And you did most of the deck creation. I mean, I was there for. I mean, hey, it was yours, man. It's my gift to you.
Well, thank you very much for my first public speaking engagement. I thought it went okay. I think obviously you're probably your own worst self-critic when it comes to that sort of thing. But yeah, I thought it went fine, and certainly had a ton of great conversations there. We kind of had. I was pretty busy actually, going from topic to topic with guests and coordinating and editing. And if you're listening to this, like Jim mentioned, this is the first week he and I are recording something after that conference. And this is the week where we also published 5 podcasts in 1 week. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Today is Wednesday for pulling down that fourth wall. We got another one coming out Thursday, tomorrow, another one coming out Friday. So it's been a pretty hectic couple of weeks, I think, for just kind of getting the show up and running. But thank you very much, Jim, for that. Appreciate it.
Yeah, well, no, it was great content. And I'd say for, folks who like the podcast, if they weren't able to listen to all 5 episodes, there was a lot of content. Kind of queue them up and listen to them during your downtime, because Jeff did a fantastic job.
Yeah, and it was pretty cool to have some listeners come up and introduce themselves. So certainly want to give a shout out and thank you again for people who took the time to come up and say hello and introduce themselves and stuff like that. So, all right, enough self-congratulatory talk. Why don't we get to our main topic today? And we're going to talk about CIAM, Consumer Identity and Access Management. And to help with that conversation, we're very fortunate to have Mr. John Tolbert. He's a lead analyst and managing director at KuppingerCole. Welcome to the show, John.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. And, I think I want to talk about your kind of identity background, because that's kind of tradition around here when someone joins us for the first time to kind of understand that. But before I get to that question, CIAM, is it consumer? Is it customer IAM? Or does it matter? Or is there a difference?
I tend to go with the definition that the C stands for consumer.
Fair enough. So consumer, I guess I'm a little more liberal with it. I might say consumer, customer, but I think this is maybe a conversation we'll kind of get into. So let's talk a little bit about your background. Maybe you can give us your identity and access management origin story. Is it something that you chose or did it choose you?
I think it's a mix of circumstance and assignment. Years and years ago, I was working for a large aerospace company with a pretty large identity system, and I was fortunate enough to get involved in an early implementation of Identity Federation, and that's kind of where it all started. From single sign-on to SAML and advanced authentication and authorization use cases. So I've had the pleasure of watching the field grow and evolve quite a bit over the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the identity space has changed over. Well, it seems like it changes every year, but I think about it like from the early 2000s up to now. I would imagine in your role as an analyst now that it's maybe a little more present for you. Does the field change from year to year, or do you feel like it stays the same relatively over the last couple of years?
I think it's a pretty exciting space overall. I think conceptually there are a lot of things that will remain the same because they work. But yeah, there's just been such interesting and good developments, especially in authentication. Now we're seeing more emphasis on, the authorization and access control pieces, for the B2E and B2B to C work case use cases. So there's lots of interesting things that are going on now that are a result of all the other related technological developments. But yeah, it's kind of a fascinating subject area, and glad to be able to watch it.
Let me throw something kind of from left field there, but just because it's fresh from my mind, having come from the Authenticate conference in Seattle, which I think is where you're based, the big topic there was the FIDO Alliance Authenticate conference, passwordless, and really kind of push that forward. And I think that's something that I think that everyone likes and would make sense for people to take advantage of. Any thoughts on passwordless? How close is it to being a real thing? Because I feel like we've been hearing it for the last couple of years now.
Yeah, passwordless is sometimes I say passwordless is really password fewer. How many times do you are able to, authenticate with your thumbprint or whatnot, but then every so often, like if you reboot, you've got to enter that password. So, I mean, really, we're all tied to passwords for the most part, in many cases, unfortunately, and it's still going to be the lowest common denominator that the bad guys will attack. So passwordless, I think, is great for user convenience. But yeah, we do really need to find a way to eliminate the passwords. And FIDO, I think, is a great organization for facilitating that. That's an organization I've been watching for quite a while now, and I think that they've made excellent progress over the last few years, and it's great to see widespread adoption, many different options out there in terms of authenticators and just the nature of the standard itself. I think that the standardization that they've done with regard to both security and the biometric pieces is going to be very advantageous for both organizations that are going to implement those kinds of technologies, as well as the vendors that have been working on that too.
Jeff, I wanted to throw my hat in the ring on passwordless. It's the way that the FIDO Alliance talked about it. It's moving from knowledge-based authentication to possession-based authentication. It was just the other day I was creating an account on a new to me system. I had to set a password and then set a knowledge-based question. What was your favorite zoo animal when you were a kid? I was like, seriously? like, how does this add to the security, right? It's just another data point you're going to stick in a database, one more way to socially engineer things. And we joked around about this, right, when we were doing our audio check coming into this call. And you said, hey, John, I want to get a sound check. What's your favorite color? And he said, I won't say what he said, but I said, yeah, in the background, Jeff is hacking into one of your accounts. Um, that it's like moving to anything that's possession based is better than that. But there were some things that came out of that conference that it's like, those are some head scratchers. Like this whole idea around push authentication, which in many ways is like the best thing we have, right? It's maybe not as good as YubiKeys for sure, but they have their own problem, right? You potentially lose them. The idea though, push authentication, there's some people out there who just hit accept as soon as it hits the phone. That's kind of worrisome. So I still don't think we have the perfect solution, but we know we have a long history now with passwords being a terrible solution, and we have to move to this passwordless future. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is that from that passwordless approach, John, is that, and this is some of the research that you've worked on. So I think we're going to talk a little bit about, the Leadership Compass report that you did on the consumer identity and access management space. Is passwordless something that consumers want? Does that, is when we talk about what makes for a good consumer identity experience, I would imagine yes, but maybe I'm too close to it and think that it certainly makes sense, but maybe folks who aren't as tied to identity don't really care. They just kind of want it to work. What are your thoughts on that?
I think people do want it to work, and I do think we're qualified to answer these questions because we're all consumers. I think there's a lot of interesting things that have been going on, and fortunately, a lot of these are packaged into product offerings today too, around risk-based continuous authentication. So, being able to examine different kinds of factors. Rather than just having to explicitly ask for username password every time. I mean, if you're coming from a location that you usually are in and it's the same computer, same browser, same phone, and the whatever it is you're asking for is kind of within normal parameters, then why bother anybody with an explicit authentication event if all this other background information kind of indicates that, yeah, this is par for the course. I think that's the continuous authentication and a lot of the ability of the CIAM packages to allow for that kind of runtime evaluation can really help reduce the number of times that we have to be explicitly authenticated.
Hey, John, we brought you on here to talk about the Leadership Compass for CIAM. It was released all the way in November 2020, so we've been trying for a while to get you on. For very much appreciative to have you here, and you're going to have another one coming out in, let's say, first half of next year. So that'll be something for folks to look forward to. What I wanted to ask you is, look, the Leadership Compass covers, it's a really broad market, a lot of use cases and a lot of vendors that go into this, kind of a lot of products that you looked at as part of this report. Broadly speaking, what is the state of the market for CIAM?
I would say it's big and continuing to grow. I mean, I think there's room for improvement in a lot of the consumer-facing sites that we go to every day, and we know that there are solutions out there which can help address some of those shortcomings. So I think that there's lots and lots of room for growth within CIAM. I mean, it's a big field already. There are some major vendors that are out there, but every time we run this report, and we've been doing them for 5+ years now, we find new entrants into the market, which says not only is there room for growth, but there's room for new entrants in the market as well, which I think makes it that much more exciting.
Yeah, I mean, it truly is a good mix of big behemoth players as well as very small players, right? And I think that is one of the ways that CIM is somewhat different from the enterprise IAM side of the house. Is you see a lot more consolidation, or maybe not consolidation, maybe that's not the right word, but I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, in the access management space on for single sign-on from an enterprise perspective, you got your Oktas and your Microsoft and Ping, and I don't want to leave anybody off the list, but you've got these really big players. It makes it hard for a smaller player to kind of make an entry into that market. But I think on the CAM side, because of the variety of use cases, because there's just so many things that aren't being addressed from a product perspective, it gives an opportunity for some smaller players. And one of the ideas that I wanted to ask you about is um, regionalization, and the idea that I think some of these entrants into the CAM market are regional plays. Obviously, they could expand beyond that. But do you see that trend as well?
Yeah, that's something we've been watching for a few years now, and that is one of the areas for innovation, and I think one of the reasons why the market continues to grow and new players come into the market is because you think about, like you said, it's very regionalized, or it can be. A company in the CIM space can launch to address the needs of a specific region. Regionalized providers can sometimes better address the local regulations. We've been talking for years about privacy, privacy regulations like GDPR, and now other ones, all across the US and then other countries too. While privacy regulations may have some things in common, or maybe even increasingly more things in common, there's still differences in how they're implemented and what the requirements, reporting requirements, compliance requirements are. So companies with that, local knowledge of how the privacy regulations work, I think that can give them an advantage in certain areas. Same thing with like integration with local IDPs. There are some countries that have national IDs, and being able to directly integrate with that, it can, in many cases, for those citizens and consumers in those areas, be really advantageous to have that direct integration with a government ID system. Or, in other cases, like in the Nordic countries, there are bank IDs. Those are pretty widespread, and there are CIM solution providers there that directly rely on those bank IDs. Plus, they have the knowledge of the local regulatory landscape. So, I think that's a trend we will continue to see in the years ahead too, and probably springing up in more and more places around the world too.
I think it's great because I think one of the things that I see a lot of information security in general is that it's sometimes hard to break into established markets. So the innovation starts to stagnate. But one of my favorite things around that is just the names of the companies that I see. I'm looking at the report right now, and there's a company called Coffee Bean. I've never heard of them, so I got to read up on them. But based on the compass here, that they're not in the leader quadrant there, kind of the upper right, but they're pretty well positioned, sort of in the middle of the pack there. I guess that's a benefit, I think, of being an upstart, is you can kind of name it whatever you want. But I thought that was interesting to see Coffee Bean on there from a naming perspective.
Yep, there are some interesting names out there for companies both in IAM and cybersecurity.
I'm going to guess that Coffee Bean might be a platform based on Java. I don't know. It could just be a guess of mine. But, I think the other thing is that when you're thinking about CIAM, there's an opportunity to take different approaches. I mean, when you look at a lot of these vendors, kind of the approach they've taken to solving what we call CIAM is different. If you think of something like Giga/SAP, it's always been kind of a marketing consumer. To me, it's always been kind of like an e-commerce focused platform. You look at Forge Rockets, the internet scale, built it from the ground up from an API perspective. Or you look at something like, Auth0, and I would also throw Okta into this, which is, a focus of more being cloud first, cloud built from the cloud up. So there are very different approaches to what they're offering. So I wonder what you're thinking, what you think of that, John. And I mean, that's, I think a big part of trying to group all these platforms into one thing we call CIAM, but yet they're very different. And how you approach that from an analyst perspective, trying to do a like for like comparison of things that in some ways are very unlike.
Yeah, that's a really great insight. I think you've identified some of the trends that have gone on over the last couple of years, especially like looking at the genesis of some of these companies. You've got large players that are focused on the e-commerce, the gathering marketing information, and being able to automate that. We have the regional players like we've been talking about, the developer focused side, the API driven. I think that's an angle that had not really been well addressed until those players came in and did that. And now, you see everyone else over the last couple of years has been sort of moving to make sure that their solutions are also microservice based, easy to write code to, easy to take one, say, consumer facing application and wrap an identity layer around that rather than needing to deploy, a full blown CIM solution. And I think that's helped them gain a lot of traction and has become very useful for other companies in CIM to take that approach as well. And, we say it all the time about, the API economy and how important it is for everything to have an API. I think that's particularly important in identity and CIM, especially where you've got a lot of information that can be shared under the right circumstances if it's protected, and APIs are the way to do that.
Absolutely. I think APIs also provide the opportunity to have a lot more flexibility in terms of a level of buffering between the front end and the data. And also kind of interfaces, getting away from having to synchronize data using meta directories or virtual directories. You see them much less in CIM architectures today than you may have seen a decade ago. But it also brings in the requirement sometimes to bring in additional technology like API gateways and enterprise service bus or message queues. So APIs, I think, provide a ton of flexibility, but they also bring with them additional requirements. And then layer on top of that the need to secure those APIs properly because they become another point of potential vulnerability within a system.
Yeah, that kind of goes toward our concept of identity fabric too, where you've got lots of different components that kind of need to work together, but also kind of need to be separate, so that you can, say, upgrade specific subsystems as needed and not have all these deep dependencies within your security and identity architecture. I think that's another good development that we've seen kind of building over the last few years too. You're talking about directories and meta directories. Yeah, I think that was one of the drivers for the evolution of CIM, something separate from, B to E IAM in the first place. Is you had generally many, many more consumers than you probably did employees. So why would you want to put them in the same directory? And then, in a lot of cases, LDAP might not have been the right, base for storing all that information. Some consumer facing companies want to be able to, be flexible about the kinds of data that they store or allow consumers to store data types of their own. So you needed the flexibility of different kinds of database. And it just makes sense to separate that and not have it necessarily tied to your production internal LDAP for employees or even employees and contractors or employees and business partners.
Right, absolutely. I wanted to ask one specific item, which I was looking in. As I was reading the report again, kind of reminded me of this topic of social identity. So log in with your Facebook or log in with your Google. In a lot of ways, it kind of feels like this was something that 5, 10 years ago seemed like it was going to overtake identity management. Everything was going to be log in with your social or log in with some kind of other identity provider. And it, in some ways, to me, feels like it failed to reach its potential or promise. And I wonder if you agree with that. And I wonder if you think it's just stalled and it's still going that way or still going to end up there, or we kind of seen it peak.
That's a good question. And as I start the next CIM research cycle, I think I'm going to try to get into that a little bit more. I'd like to know, from the vendor perspective, what are they seeing in terms of utilization of social logins? I mean, you're absolutely right. When CIM platforms kind of evolved out of general IAM platforms, that was one of the benefits was to be able to use social logins and not have to create other accounts. But I mean, obviously, pretty much anywhere you go, you still see those options to log in, but it would be interesting to know how widely utilized are those. That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that, but I would like to know.
Yeah, I think just as an observer of it, I think they're very convenient for people who know how to use them and have kind of taken that approach of consolidating their online identities to one identity provider, Google, Facebook, whatever it may be. But I think there's also backlash to it, right? I think if you think about just the last year that Facebook alone has had hasn't been positive from a PR perspective, and it's kind of been trending downwards from a public perception perspective for any number of reasons. But if you've locked in a service 5 years ago or 10 years ago, whatever it was, with login with Facebook, who's going to go to the effort to actually change that? So I think it's sticky, and now we're seeing essentially a new service come up, signing in with Apple, which is basically the same thing. It's more privacy focused in that it obfuscates email address and kind of acts as an in-between layer if you choose it to. But I think it's interesting that, Jim, to your point, you're talking about is like, has it reached its crescendo? I would agree. It seems like it kind of stalled, but all of a sudden Apple just got into the game with that sign in with Apple process. And I'm starting to see it on more and more websites and apps and things like that. So I think it would be curious to see, what is the uptake on some of that stuff? And, are there ramifications based on the perception of the IDP itself, whether it's Facebook, Apple, Google, Microsoft, whatever it may be? Does that impact people's willingness to use it as an IDP either going forward, or do they go backwards and, relinquish that command and go off and create another account, or potentially link another IDP to it, which I would imagine would cause some headaches for organizations that have kind of consolidated on one or two, and they don't have a way to kind of link up records, maybe if they're, signed in with one provider versus another.
Yeah, that's a good observation. I think a lot of it does have to do with trust. And I remember, years ago, starting on the identity path here, there were thoughts that maybe one day, you could have a single ID with various personas, but obviously we never got to that, and I don't think we ever will. I think the idea that you would only use a single ID provider has become somewhat problematic, and even though we were mentioning earlier about regional regional CIM providers and their ability to use region specific IDPs, there are use cases, people that certainly wouldn't want to use government ID for everything either. So I think a lot of it does have to do with perception about the identity provider and where a given consumer wants to use that credential.
Yeah, that's a good observation. I think, Jeff, your observation with how much trust do people, not only people but the organizations who use those identity providers, trust them. I think big tech's been in the news. Whether however you want to classify big tech, I think most of the major social login providers would qualify. And what do people think of that? How concerned are they about their privacy? And that is probably the same points that would apply to what John said with regard to government ID. How much do you trust the government to, deal with your private information, or knowing what websites you're going to, or what products you're buying, and things like that? So, John, I wanted to ask you a few kind of technical questions about the report. And I think this is a question that comes to my mind with a lot of analyst reports. If I don't see a technology vendor included in the report that maybe I expected to see, I wonder, why was that vendor excluded? And that might not be the case. I'm kind of wondering, how do you pick who's included and who's not included? Is there some kind of participation required on their end?
Yeah, so especially in a big field like this, lots of different players. We try to identify all the ones that fit our criteria, and it's a process that takes several months. So we start with inviting all of those, and then we move on to the next step, which is kind of a lengthy technical questionnaire. And sometimes companies may not have the time to dedicate to engaging fully, so that we could get a good complete picture of where they are. So it takes a lot of information to be able to produce the reports, and there are just occasionally times when maybe a vendor that you might expect to be in there might not have had time to participate this go round. So we do offer that up every time. So hopefully, if there's one or two that you were hoping to see last time, we'll be able to include them this time.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was also noticing is obviously there are a lot more solutions that are cloud based, a lot that were traditionally on prem are starting to come out with cloud offerings, or their cloud offerings are becoming more mature, very mature. Is that an overall finding that you would concur with, that the market's going cloud?
I would say so. Yeah, I mean, especially for CIAM, for workforce identity, there's going to be an on-prem solution for that for the foreseeable future. But I think companies realize the value of deploying in the cloud first, letting the vendor handle a lot of the background maintenance tasks, and keeping everything up to date, and also being able to provide the scale that's needed. And again, as workforce and consumer use cases kind of diverge in some ways, I think it continues to make sense, and we'll see more of an emphasis both from the vendor side on getting people on their cloud hosted solutions, as well as customers just deciding it sure would be a lot easier to deal with CIM in the cloud than building out infrastructure to support it.
John, was there anything that jumped out at you as unique or interesting in the report that maybe you didn't expect to find?
Well, yeah, I'm kind of watching a couple of trends, and this will probably go into the update of the report. I think that the CIM field is quite large, like we said before, but there's also some specialties that have kind of arisen in the last few years. One around, consent and privacy management as a focus, and then also customer data platforms. That's another big field about unifying all the different databases of information you've got about your customers and consumers. I think seeing how those work together and, where the lines of delineation are between these different kinds of products, there will likely be an emphasis on privacy, for the foreseeable future. So it's probably not unexpected to see separate development in different kinds of products to address that. But also, I think that companies that want to, hire a CIM solution are going to want that built in to a degree as well. And that's what we noticed the last time in the market is that there are vendors that are specializing, and offering lots and lots of features around privacy management, and others that kind of give you the basic tool set and let you figure out how to comply with whatever regulatory environments you operate in on your own.
You kind of answered the question I was just thinking in my head right now was around that privacy and consent module. That's certainly taken off in the last year or so I've seen in the market. And, I wonder from a product perspective, is privacy and consent a baseline feature that CIAM technologies need to have? Or is it something that they should be partnering up with kind of a dedicated vendor in that space, or maybe it's an acquisition target? I guess, what are your thoughts on that privacy and consent part, John? Is that baseline, or is it still considered kind of separate from pure authentication?
I think it's kind of both right now. I mean, you've got some vendors in CIM that have, excellent privacy and consent built right into it. And then you've got these newer companies in consent and privacy management that are doing something kind of new and different, and they're API driven so that, again, there might be opportunities to do some interesting things and interoperate between CIM and these CPM vendors. And yeah, I think it's kind of good foreshadowing to think that there probably will be acquisitions, especially in that area, where maybe a CIM vendor needs to augment the capabilities they have around consent management. So they could become targets of acquisition.
Hey, John, one of the things I've seen within the past couple of years is that platforms are gaining, a much stronger set of IAM and CIAM capabilities. So if you take a system like a platform like Salesforce, they're kind of forcing their way into the conversation, maybe not as a standalone CIAM vendor, but if you are let's call it a Salesforce shop, you have to at least look at their offering to see if it makes sense because they surround kind of those core authentication, authorization, registration, basic user lifecycle management with a lot of marketing analytics type of capabilities. I mean, do you see that as well?
Yeah, yeah, and I think that kind of relates to what you were saying earlier too about, I mean, I guess I'd call it islands of identity or, our identity fabric. I think that there are these ecosystems of services and related services that have their own identity component, but yet they need to interoperate with, the productivity environments and other kinds of cloud IDPs. So, I'm certainly glad that we have standards in those areas to help with that interoperability, OAuth, OIDC, SAML, and things like that to make it a bit easier.
So, John, I wanted to ask kind of a wrap up question for this, which is, you know, thinking about it's kind of the "Are we there yet?" question. Do we have what we need in the market, or put your Nostradamus cap on, if you would, and talk about what you see coming in the near future that's going to get us there, or are we are we just going to drift? For the next many years, decades. Where do you see this thing going?
I think there are lots of good solutions out there today. I mean, in reviewing all these products every year or two, I'm always pleased to see lots of innovation and lots of capabilities that are built in that address, a multiplicity of use cases, across different industries, whether it's finance, insurance, medical, all aspects of our consumer lives. But I think what we really need to do, and by we, I mean identity professionals as well as, the vendors of these products, is help the customers, the consumer facing organizations that buy CIM products implement that stuff fully and make it as useful as it can be. You think about, your last 10 experiences online as a consumer, how many of them have been what you think that they should be, as an identity professional or as a consumer? I mean, I think we all encounter times most every week, if not every day, that we look at something and say, hey, there's room for improvement here. And then if you're in this business, what the technical solutions are. Sometimes we're left scratching our heads wondering, well, why don't they just, do this? Why don't we have MFA there? Why do I have to, fill out security questions when we know that these are a really bad idea? So I think the next wave really should address how to help these consumer facing organizations take it up the next level and offer all the good capabilities that are already there. Education, showing these companies how to do it, what the benefits are, and the benefits could be, many in terms of, reduced fraud, better conversion of registrations. Because, if you have a registration process that's really laborious or you ask too much information up front, some consumers will just abandon it and say, this isn't worth my time providing all this information up front. And there are better ways to do it than that. We know that. So, helping these companies get to a point where they can offer really thorough solutions and see that implemented across all their customers is what I think we really need to focus on next.
I think part of it's a design issue too. Making sure that you're designing for the customer in mind and putting them into, set them up for success, not only from just a user experience perspective, but from a security perspective. I think back to a conversation that I had with Bob Lord while I was at Authenticate, and he talked about this thing called, and I'll paraphrase it, but the MFA tax. Essentially, authentication providers who are selling products that then charge extra to use MFA. Like, at what point does that make sense to be like, yeah, that's baseline because that helps you in so many other ways and should just be part of the product? Which I thought was interesting from again, you call it the MFA tax, which I think is probably pretty fair.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that should be part of the baseline product, MFA, and any other security related improvement that you can make. It's worth charging the premium for up front because it's something that will, in the end, help your customer and their consumers. Security, too often, as we know, has been an afterthought or something that's perceived as costly. But when you see the value of putting in preventive measures, then I think that's the right way to go.
Well, John, you've been really gracious with your time, so do want to kind of wrap things up and be cognizant of that time. So let's start to swim back up to the surface, and we like to end on a lighter note here. And I'm going to ask a question to both you and Jim, and it will be this: what movie or TV show do you wish you could watch again for the first time?
Wow, let's see. How about the first Lord of the Rings movie?
Ooh, that's a good one. I like that. What was it about the first Lord of the Rings movie that just blew you away?
I would say it was just the scale of it, the scale of the landscapes and how the story was told.
Mm-hmm. Jim, what about yourself?
Oh, this is a tough question for me because I'm sitting here thinking of how many, my favorite genre of movies is comedies, but I feel it would be kind of a wasted opportunity if you were presented with this golden ticket to see some movie for the first time and I just said Office Space or Old School or something like that. I mean, that would be really cool to laugh my butt off for an hour and a half, 2 hours, but what I'm going to say is Forrest Gump. I just, that movie just had such an impact on me. And I thought it was so well scripted and acted and everything. I mean, it's ways to become part of, our culture. So that's my choice, Forrest Gump.
Forrest Gump. Right on. I wrestle with this one because I think there are three things that come to mind. The first one is my no-brainer. It's The Matrix. I love The Matrix, especially the first one. Just kind of like, what? It's like, this is crazy. I remember seeing it in the theaters, and I was like, I got to get more of that. Even Matrix 2, 3, and 4, which is coming out soon, I am like all in. I will watch any of those. The second one is The Sixth Sense. I thought that was so well done, and just to be like, again, it's like, oh my gosh, like, the guy is talking to dead people, right? It's like, this is like, he was dead the whole time. Like, that was crazy. So I think Sixth Sense will be my real answer, but my honorable mention will be Lord of the Rings, the Red Wedding episode, where they basically killed off most of the Starks in kind of one fell swoop, and people just didn't see it coming. And just the internet reaction for all the people in the world who did not spoil it for the people who hadn't seen it before, myself included, was just amazing to kind of watch the people who read the books, let the people who were watching the show who hadn't read the books come to that realization in real time instead of spoiling it. I thought was amazing as well.
Well, the angle to that, though, is also how many TV shows actually kill off a bunch of the stars? Very few. And that's what really blew me away with what show we're talking about?
Game of Thrones.
Well, Jim, it's not TV, it's HBO.
Right. So yeah, that was what blew me away with Game of Thrones. Sorry.
Yeah. So those are my three. Okay. So I think we successfully navigated ourselves back up to the top here, surface level. Before we wrap up, John, any final words of wisdom for people who are looking at the CIAM market, confused, unsure? What should they be looking at? I guess, what are some words of wisdom that you can kind of impart on people who are either just getting started or kind of reevaluating their strategy in that space?
I would say first and most important thing is MFA, multi-factor authentication. Make sure you can get that. It's great for not only reducing the prevalence of fraud, but it, can help in cases of ransomware too, for workforce. So MFA on both sides of the IAM fence is extremely useful, and hope to see it deployed everywhere.
MFA, all the things, all the time.
Yep.
Jim, how about yourself?
I would just recommend for all of our IAM practitioner listeners out there, if you want to get a copy of this report, I know you can go to fortrock.com and download it for free. We'll have that in the show notes, I'm sure. But it's 100+ pages of goodness. I mean, if we're in this space, this is how we learn, right? And I don't think many people sit and read a 100-page document like this word for word. You can skim, but really right in the front section of that document, there's a lot of educational material. I would say go out there, give it a read. The focus, I think, should be that area where you get that education. Of course, if you're in the market for a CIAM, you are going to want to, explore further. And of course, in the role that Jeff and I are in, we're doing that. And then I think the other thing is, if you are you're working for a technology company and they're in the CIAM space, is for my money, the KuppingerCole report is one of the best ones related to CIAM. So here's your plug, John. Because
well, thank you.
I mean, this is true. I think this is one of the better documents. So I think vendors should be taking this one very seriously and working to get included.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, leverage that. Is it the KuppingerCole Plus or membership subscription? I mean, there's a ton of great research there. We'll have a link to KuppingerCole in the show notes so people can find it easily as well. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and call it for this week. John, thank you so much for your time. Jim, thank you so much for your time as well. Don't forget, you can visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com. We're also on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. We'll have a link to John and KuppingerCole and Jim and myself on LinkedIn as well, so that we can connect with any of us or all of us. Tell us what you like, didn't like, show ideas, etc. Happy to engage. And with that, we'll talk with you all in the next one. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.